I was a sophomore at Wright Junior College in Chicago in 1981, quite determined to be a professional broadcaster, listening to the progressive FM station that shaped my whole cosmology when a song so compelling came on that when I arrived at my parking spot at school, I couldn't stop listening to the radio and go to class. The song was B Movie, a stinging critique of recently elected Ronald the Reagan, as described by the vocalist, alluding to the fact that Reagan was a former B movie actor. Gil Scott-Heron, really more a poet than a singer, but with a baritone voice that's as compelling as it is unmistakable. This experience led, it pains me to admit, to 41 years and counting of appreciation for the music of Gil Scott-Heron. Aldon Lynn Nielsen says the time is right to say it straight. Gil Scott-Heron should be recognized as an important writer. As the George and Barbara Kelly Professor Emeritus of American Literature at Penn State University, specializing in, among other things, African-American poetry and poetics, Aldon Lynn Nielsen has published several books of his own poetry, along with scholarly books and anthologies such as Black Chant, Languages of African-American Postmodernism. Today we talk about his essay, Choruses for Gil Scott-Heron. Aldon, what's the word?
Thunderbird.
What's the price?
What was it, 30 twice?
I heard it was 20 twice, so I guess there was some
25.
inflation. But
Well,
you
neither one of us is old enough to have actually experienced that version of it.
that's true, but I'm in the bandwidth of knowing people who did, right?
Yeah. Well, and as I mentioned in the essay, there was a record by I forget his name, Arthur Prysock's brother. I forget what his first name was. So people can actually go out. It's probably online somewhere and find that song and hear how much people in the 1940s were paying for their Thunderbird.
Was it the 1940s?
Well, it started back. Thunderbird was created again. I don't have my essay in front of me, but I seem to recall Thunderbird was created maybe in the 20s.
Wow.
Um, so they would have been using the slogan by the 30s, and by the 40s, it was definitely, something that people would exchange as a greeting on the street. Now,
Well,
for the people out there who have no idea what we're talking about, Thunderbird was a very cheap, fortified, horrible wine. But because it was cheap, teenagers and alcoholics tended to favor it.
right. Let's look at Thunderbird.
Mhm.
How did you first hear about Gil?
Well, I experienced very much like yours, although very much earlier. As a teenager, I was driving down the street in my father's car with the radio tuned to, it was a top 40 station, as they used to be constituted back in the 60s or the early 70s, I forget which. And I heard the revolution will not be televised. And it's hard for some people to comprehend that actually was a hit internationally. That record played everywhere, continued to play everywhere. And in my essay, I mentioned the way that that title has become such a part of the language that people use it all the time and don't always even know where it came from. Um, just in the last week, I've heard political commentaries on some of the streaming news channels where people say, well, they said the revolution wouldn't be televised, and no mention of Gil Scott-Heron, and I'm not sure they even know that that's the person who wrote that. The remarkable thing is that he had that hit when he was 19 years old, 1920, somewhere in there. And by the time he was only 1 year older than I am, but at the time I met him, he had already published two novels and three long-playing record albums and a book of poetry, which is, I think we can all agree, remarkable for someone who in his early 20s at that point. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you describe Gil to, say, a younger person who may not have been exposed to him or his work?
Well, if you're being lazy about it, you probably just use the phrase he didn't care for and tell him he was the godfather of rap or something like that. And of course, rap meant something different to people of Gil's age. We use the term rapping just for staying up all night talking to each other. Or you'd say someone had a good rap, meaning they had a good line of speech, something they'd been thinking about that they could articulate. And it's only in the 70s that late 70s, that the term becomes associated with that particular rhyming recording, spoken word recording over hip hop music. And of course, that was radically different from what Gil Scott Heron himself did. His songs all rhymed, but most of his poetry did not. And if you listen to the albums where he recites music over poetry, things like H2O Gate, Watergate Blues, and so forth. He'll break into rhyme once in a while, but it is not the hip hop rhyming rap that my students grew up listening to. When I'm not being lazy, I'll explain to him that he was a remarkably successful recording artist at a time when people felt that their songs should really be about something. The songs should have political action in the world and so forth. And that he was able to combine for the years that he was healthy, he was able to combine a popular music success, touring constantly, putting out albums and so forth, um, with lyrics that really were forward thinking, politically progressive, and so forth.
The revolution will not be televised seems pretty prophetic,
Yeah.
given the collapse of legacy media. Now we have streaming and social mierda and Substack. Can you talk about this and some of Gil's other prophetic stances?
Mhm. Well, the one we were alluding to at the beginning, a song called Johannesburg, grows out of a moment when there was an enormous anti-apartheid movement growing, particularly among college students in the United States. And I think this is important to remember because it really set the stage for the later Occupy movement and some of the anti-ICE movements that are happening right now. Um, Sometimes it's hard for me to credit that South Africa was still under racial apartheid right up until I was almost 40 years old. My wife and I actually had the great opportunity to go see Nelson Mandela on his first tour of the United States when he appeared at the Oakland Stadium, which was full. The whole world of the Bay Area turned out to see Nelson Mandela. But in the years leading up to that, during the Reagan administration, you mentioned in Reagan with B movie, during the Reagan administration, they adopted a policy that they euphemistically termed constructive engagement. And what that really meant was letting the Afrikaners in South Africa be as dictatorial and racist as they wanted to be. Um, so in the end, it was not anything American politicians did. It was not anything the government officially did that really put the nail in the coffin of apartheid. The student-led protests, the boycotts, and again, these were boycotts that were asked for by the African Liberation Congress, African National Congress themselves. Um, Slowly what happened, and should have happened years before, was the white people who ran the economy of South Africa realized one day that they could still rule the economy without ruling the political structure. And that's pretty much what's happened. There's no longer the legal segregation, but there's not really a lot of economic opportunity in South Africa. Quick footnote: some of the people watching and listening to this may be aware that while our current president has been saying horrible things about all African nations and clamping down. In fact, my wife and I were supposed to go see an African National Ballet, and we weren't able to because the Reagan administration cut off their visas. Meanwhile, as you know, white Afrikaners are being allowed to come to the United States of America. And meanwhile, we've just now learned in the news that wealthy Israelis are paying for Gazans to be resettled in South Africa. Uh, you can only imagine what Gil would have thought about that because he was always finding these deadly ironies in the middle of our politics.
He had a knack for it. It was amazing. I'll never forget that experience in my Toyota Celica GT, though, a little white car that was mine, and coming up and just having my mind blown. And B movie, and it just the love affair kind of continued after that. I think about gun. Everybody got a pistol, everybody got a 45. The philosophy seems to be, near as I can see, the day they give up theirs, I give up mine.
Fine, yeah.
And
Which
we have
apparently is the position of the conservative Supreme Court today.
there you go. That's exactly right. So the prophecy,
Yeah.
his focus on certain things. Saturday night just ain't that special was one of the
Mhm.
lines from that. You write in this essay, choruses for Gil Scott-Heron, quote, and signature though the piece may be, it has failed to secure Gil Scott-Heron a suitable berth in the canons of American poetry. Please elaborate on that.
Well, a couple of things. Signature in the sense that musicians talking about having a signature tune, a song that you're expected to play everywhere you go. Interestingly enough, Gil very seldom performed that after about age 26 or 27, but it was still a signature. I guess it got replaced by Johannesburg and The Bottle in particular, which was a big hit in the early 70s. But I forgot the initial question, having
The
wandered off there.
canon, Gil in the canon. How come?
Yes, yes, yes. We should also mention, by the way, this essay is going to appear in a special issue of the Langston Hughes Review that's currently being printed. And I don't know if the whole issue is dedicated to Gil, but it's a special issue built around Gil. They did one around Sterling Brown, who was a big influence on Gil Scott-Heron a little bit earlier. But yeah, you look at African-American poetry anthologies, American poetry anthologies, he's usually not there. Or if he is there, it's just that one piece and it's in some subsection that's not thought of as being particularly literary. Um, Odd footnote there. In the months and first couple of years after Gil Scott-Heron passed away, several of us organized panels where critics got together to discuss his work. And these panels were accepted at the Modern Language Association, the American Language Association, the College Language Association, American Studies. The one, the one organization that refused the Gil Scott-Heron panel was the
I
AWP,
knew you were going to say it. I knew it. I knew
the
it.
Organization of Writers. And in the proposal, I even emphasized the fact most people aren't aware of this, although he makes quite a point of it in his last book. He was a creative writing teacher for a couple of years. That's how I came to know him. And the fact that even the creative writing programs would not put on accept a panel on Gil Scott-Heron is just indicative. His prose works, people really need to be aware of them.
Indicative of what?
Well, a certain closed-mindedness. We probably don't need to go too much farther than that. But anyway, the people really need to be aware of his prose work. His first novel, published when he was, or written when he was 19 years old. He tells a great story about that. He was a student at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, one of two places claiming to be the oldest HBCUs in America. And he actually went into the dean and said, Dean, I want to take a semester off. I'm still going to stay in the dorm room because I paid for it, and I'm going to write a novel. Now, you can imagine how most deans would react to that, but they let him do that, and he did write a novel. It's called The Vulture, and it's good not just for a 19-year-old kid to have written it, but just if you're a genre fiction lover, it's a good mystery novel, and it's very much of its time in terms of the cultural reference within it. The second novel I've never thought was quite as good. Well, I can't say the title on there, The N-Word Factory. It's about a revolutionary moment at an HBCU, loosely modeled on Howard University and one of the universities in Virginia. Um, it's okay, but it's not that good to my mind. But fast forward to the last years of his life, um, he wrote a memoir, kind of. He actually wrote two versions of this manuscript, one in the first person and one in the third person. And a good part of the book is about the struggle to get the Martin Luther King holiday, which is that was a struggle he was very active in. There's a famous video you can find online of him and Stevie Wonder and all these other activists on the steps of the Capitol building singing Stevie Wonder's song "Happy Birthday." And the other part of the book is just regular memoir telling the all too sad story of his life. His father was a Jamaican soccer player who left while Gil was still an infant. And then his mother, having ambitions of her own, left him with his grandmother in Tennessee while she went off to have something of a career. And she came back years later and took him to New York. So he literally never had a real father figure in his life. Um, and his relations with women often turned out sad. There's a new book out I just read that's a dual biography of his father and him. And again, there's a great deal still to be learned, but you sort of begin to understand some of the sadness of his familial relationships when you read this new book. At one point, he was married to Brenda Sykes, who was a very famous actress at the time, African-American actress. And again, he had a child with her who is now, well into adulthood, but then wound up splitting up. He was never able to have a long-term family to be part of. And of course, the drug problems, which just grew worse and worse over the decades, just aggravated that. He essentially died alone. Um, but he died at a time when he had just put out a new album. I forget the name of the producer, but this producer had sought him out. And it's an odd album. It has some cover songs on it. It has some old material. There's one piece where it's almost more like a folk singer style guitar playing in the background while he reads one of his pieces. Um, but none of us knew it was going to be the last word. It's a very short CD. It's only about 30 minutes long. And there's a great song in there which turned out again to be as prophetic as he always was, titled "New York is Killing Me." But of course, it was his own failings. I was part of a memorial symposium for Gil at the Langston Hughes Library in New York City, and one of the other people on the symposium with me was the great poet Sonia Sanchez, and she was telling me of an event she participated in where Gil was also performing, and that she was talking to him in his dressing room, and these furtive fellows kept coming in, and it was clear what was going on. And Sonia says she looked at him and said, "You don't need this." And he looked sort of abashed and said, "I know." But that's what killed him in the end, his inability. Uh, if anybody needed something to scare them away from crack cocaine, that story should do it. I mean, he was this brilliant man who just on the verge of being known to a new generation wound up dying as a direct result. He actually died from an infection. He had HIV, also tied to the drug issues. And of all things, he got a spider bite in England, where he'd been performing over there, and it became infected and it killed him. And we have all too many of these stories in popular entertainment. I always think back to those years in my youth when one after the other was Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison. Just always self-inflicted, not suicide, but self-inflicted. So Gil, on the one hand, is a towering model for people who want to write conscious material that's also good work, you know, uh, and a cautionary tale that if success gives you the opportunity to ruin yourself, it's not that hard to do.
Right. There's a passage in the essay that discusses Gil's writing process that happens in large part via performance. The passage goes, on those occasions when he could present a large band format, he would sometimes deliver monologues and poems standing up with a handheld mic, but always he was working a text that grew over time till it seemed he'd located himself within it sufficiently to stabilize a final version. Can you think of any other poets of note who worked this way? David Anton comes to mind, but
Well,
not in the same way,
David Anton was doing a whole different thing, and without music. At least I never saw him do it with music. And,
right?
and for the people in the audience who aren't familiar, he started out as a considerable lyric poet. In fact, I love David Anton's early work. But then at some point, and by the way, he was married to the great artist Eleanor Anton. At some point, he decided instead of giving poetry readings, he would give talks. And he actually distinguished between the talks that he meant in that sense and what we might call a talk where he was invited somewhere to, I don't know, give a lecture about something. But I saw him do this at the Folger Library for the first time when I was young. He would have a cassette recorder sitting beside him and he would turn it on and he proceed to talk around some particular subject. In the case of the one at the Folger, it was around illness and doctors and so forth. And then you knew it was over when he leaned over and stopped the cassette and put it in his pocket. Well, then he would go home and he would type up a manuscript, spacing the clumps of words very deliberately. And eventually these would be published in book form. So they don't look like poetry. And I'm not sure that he called them talks. There have always been poets who worked with music. In fact, one of the great inspirations for Gil, not one of my favorites, although I recognize their historic importance, was The Last Poets. And in fact, one thing you'll learn from his biographies was that while he was a student at Lincoln University, he was the one who arranged for the Last Poets to come up from New York and perform there. And that gave him the chance to meet those guys. And he was very much interested. He already had a little music group he was doing with Brian Jackson there on their campus called the Blacks and the Blues. And this gave him an opportunity to talk to these guys and get a few hints. If you go back and look at images from the late 1960s and early 1970s, it would seem that every poet had a conga drum nearby. And in fact, I used to joke that the morning after Santana played at Woodstock, every band in America had a conga player. It was almost true. So there's, when we think of the beat era, we think of a guy with a beret wearing shades and playing bongos and reciting poetry, that sounds maybe like Gregory Corso or somebody. In the 60s and 70s, when we think about Black spoken word poetry, we same beret, same sunglasses, but we're in a dashiki and conga players and reciting movement poetry. And again, the last poets are probably the most well-known example of that. But that style lasted for a good long time, and it was at the beginnings of Gil's work. If you listen to his very first album, that's mostly what's on the album: spoken word poetry with some drummers behind him. He was fortunate enough that there were the record label had a budget to bring in some of the great jazz musicians at the time for the second album. And he repeats "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised," but it's that big band version that is the one that was on the radio and became so popular. But yeah, getting back to your question, there are still nowadays most people who do something like that are on spoken word stages, which isn't the biggest appeal to me. But there are still poets who work with music in one way or another. In fact, now that I'm retired from teaching, I'm trying more and more to find opportunities to play some music along with my poetry and poetry readings. Um, in fact, I'll be doing that Saturday night for a few minutes in Salem, Massachusetts. But the he would do this even when he couldn't have a big band. The last few times I saw him perform, he didn't have the kind of money to bring 10 people on stage with him. So it was usually guitar, bass, drums, and another pianist in addition to himself. And he would come out and he would sit at his Fender Rhodes piano, which are the musicians in the audience will know has a very distinctive sound. Before he started singing, before he started playing any music, he would sit at that piano and start reciting one of these pieces. And one of the examples I mentioned in the essay is the one I always just call "Must Be Deep." Uh, on stage, it will wind up being like a 15-minute monologue about what he called bluesology. But in the middle of it, he tells this little story about the junior high teacher who gives him this poem that doesn't make any sense, and how people, when they're trying to be quote unquote poetic, or when they don't understand something, they say, must be deep. All of us who are young poets have had exactly that experience. Yeah. And that's not an argument that poetry shouldn't be deep. But anyway, so these monologues would grow. Again, you can find several of them on any live recording. You'll hear one. If you want to see him in that exact mode where he's standing up doing it with a larger band, there's a video called Black Wax. There was for many years in Washington D.C. there was a wax museum, and towards the end of its time, it moved over southwest or southeast, not far from the Capitol building. And then shortly went out of business because nobody cared about wax museums anymore. And it was turned into a club. And, I saw Stevie Ray Vaughan. I saw King Sunny Ade from Nigeria. Ornette Coleman played there. So anyway, Gil Scott-Heron and his major, bigger band performed there. And I can never know how to pronounce this name. There's a director named Mugge, Mugi. I'm not sure. He also did a Sun Ra documentary and several others. But go online and find Black Wax, and you'll see Gil Scott-Heron with his band at his peak doing the monologues in the songs. But even in those last years, if you find some of the really late videos, there's somewhere it's just him and his piano because he doesn't have any money to even hire a band. He would still do these monologues, and they were quite brilliant. And as I said, they would grow over time. They would shift gears, move. The recorded ones are easy to find too. The album "Winter in America" has his Watergate blues, but almost all of them. There was an album called Spirits in the '90s that was a kind of a comeback album, and it has a piece on it called Message to the Messengers. And there is a musical background, but it's Gil Scott-Heron talking to the young rappers of the 90s. So that's an interesting moment, given the way people tend to like to think of him in connection with rap and hip hop and so forth.
Yeah. What would you say are among the goals of the revolution that Gil talked about and sang about?
Well, this gets tangled too. At the time that he wrote that piece, he was talking about, Black political and social liberation generally. Um, the piece also is an outright attack on public televisual culture of the time. So there are all sorts of, really sarcastic references to the television news of the day, and even the soap operas. Now, Gil Scott-Heron loved genre fiction and genre movies. And so it's no surprise that you find him making these references to soap operas in that piece. Some of those soap operas went on for another 30 years after the time of that song. But he talks about how when the revolution comes, you'll no longer see Dick getting down with Jane or search for a brighter day and so forth. Um, I forget what kind of toothpaste it is, will no longer give you sex appeal. But he also attacks some of the more mainstream middle class leadership of the time uh, in ways that I'm sure are unfair, but they make for good satire. So he attacks like the then current leadership of the NAACP and other organizations. This was the Black Power moment. And again, there's a lot of misunderstanding about that, and there'll be even more now that we have government actively stopping people from teaching about these things. Black Power was about self-determination. Newark, New Jersey is a perfect example of this, where Amiri Baraka was doing his work. Um, the Black majority population of that city had never had control of the government until at some point when they got organized and elected the first Black mayor. And you see this same pattern repeated in cities all over the United States. Chicago is another example. My own hometown of Washington, D.C. is the classic example. Um, so a matter of, being able to make the political decisions that determine how you live your life. And Black people had not really ever had that liberty in the past. So the overall meaning of the poem is exactly that: Black self-determination, liberation from old ways of thinking, and so forth. Now, the term revolution can mean any damn thing, of course. It could be a media revolution, a consciousness revolution, an actual revolution. There were people at the time who seemed to be uh, of the holding to the illusion that somehow, Black people would take up the gun and take control of the government or something. That was never, ever, ever going to happen. That was not even the Black Panthers program, and they're the ones who talked about revolution and guns probably more than anybody. But they were talking about self-defense. In fact, their original title was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Um, so, like all great poetry, that song works so well and is lived so long because each generation can find a different meaning inside it. And they can be talking about a different revolution in each generation, or even within one generation. Even in the 60s and 70s, when people spoke of revolution, they didn't all mean the same thing. Yeah. But here was a poem capacious enough and funny enough that people can still, as you did, recite lyrics from it to this day.
Yeah. Why is it important for you to try and reframe the narrative about Gil from proto-rap artist to writer with literary merit?
Well, partly because I'm a writer and a reader, and also because of the personal connection, as I outline in this essay, and also talk about in an interview book called Memoirs. Um, I really didn't hear much of Gil Scott-Heron after that first radio experience because I didn't have any money. I was getting drafted. I was able to do alternative civilian service in freaking Schenectady, New York, of all places. Um, the American Selective Service decided that, okay, they wouldn't send me out to shoot people in Vietnam. Instead, they would turn me into a community organizer in Schenectady, New York. But again, I was paid $100 a month. You can't live on $100 a month. I wasn't buying records, but a friend of mine in the neighborhood bought the third Gil Scott-Heron album, the one that has the Get Out of the Ghetto Blues on it. I think it's the third, it might be the second. And I recognized the voice. I said, oh, that's the same guy. And then he played the whole album for me. So I was able to hear the spoken word parts and the songs and everything. And then I got undrafted. Turned out I'd been illegally drafted in the first place. That's a story for another broadcast. Same thing happened to Ron Silliman. We were both unlawfully drafted and did our service. But so I came back home to Washington, D.C., and I wanted to go back to school. And again, I didn't have any money. Federal City College was there, a land grant institution that charged, my students go crazy when I tell them it's $85 a semester full time. And so the first day of registration, I'm going there, and I had no intention of signing up for creative writing because I was already publishing a couple of poems. I thought I was hot shit, hot stuff. I don't. We say the S word on TV these days, so I'm not sure what the issues are. But anyway,
We can say shit. It's okay.
okay, I talk a lot of shit. But anyway, so I go into registration and I'm looking at the catalog, and there's creative writing, Gil Scott-Heron. I said, well, there can't be two people with this name. Turns out there were, but the other one was his father, the soccer player. So I said, I got to do this. So I signed up and took that class. So I first met him in his capacity, not just as a writer, but as a writing instructor. And again, he only did it for a couple of years. He's one of those people who had to give up the day job as a professor to take over the day job as a traveling musician. Unusual career. If you read his last book, it's called The Last Holiday, by the way. In the final chapter, he actually says, and I quote this in the essay, that he thought he did his best writing during those couple of years when he was also teaching. And in some ways, I think that's true. That's when the album Winter in America comes out, which I still think is the best sounding album he ever recorded. Lots of good songs on all of the albums, but I'm just the sound quality itself is just so superior on that one. And that was another instance of self-determination. He and Brian Jackson and friends went to a studio in suburban Maryland. They picked their own guy to come in and produce the recordings. And it's just a much fuller sound, particularly the Fender Rhodes just sounds beautiful on that album. Despite the title, there's no actual song on there called Winter in America. That comes on the next album, the one that's from South Carolina to South Africa. But he was always primarily a songwriter. The books of poems aren't all that great in my own reading, but the first novel, if you like genre fiction, is a good novel. The last book makes you wish he'd written more books like that. It's just that good. Um, and he's a consummate, songwriter, and you can see that from the number of people who covered his songs. Everybody from Little Lester Phillips to almost every hip hop artist of the '80s to now, and you still hear. I hear his music in commercials to this day. And again, they aren't identifying who he is or anything, but they're he's still got that presence there. And I'm hoping that there's enough royalties coming in to help his children a little bit. They're probably not seeing very much of that money. But he thought of himself as a writer first.
Yeah.
And the last we know of him after he passes away is that book that comes out posthumously, which again is his writing. And he and Brian Jackson originally, they didn't think of themselves as people who were going to be performing artists for their whole careers. They thought they were going to be like McCartney and Lennon or Rodgers and Hammerstein. They thought they were going to be mostly songwriters, and Gil wanted to be a novelist. But they were so successful with the songs that he wound up having a much bigger career as a musician. In my view, people always talk about all the sampling. He's one of the most heavily sampled artists in hip hop. But in my view, a lot of the music still holds up, even now. It's not a musical style that was tied to any particular era, even though it grew out of those eras. So, for example, there's been a big revival, sort of early '70s soul jazz in recent years, which I've enjoyed. But that's not the kind of music they're really playing. It comes out of jazz and the blues, but it's not tied to any particular era's style. And I think that's what really makes it work. That's also why, to me, that last album with the guy just kind of doing arpeggios on the guitar in the background is kind of jarring because that was never the kind of music that the two of them did together.
My wife and I were in Japan last week. Among the things we did was visit the grave of Basho. And
Wow.
it makes me think, and, this is, he's buried there 400 years ago, you know, and it makes me think, how does, not that I'm interested in it, but how does literary immortality happen? And
Uh,
and is it in the cards for Gil?
well, the bigger question is why and how. You know, when I'm talking to my grad students, I make a point, other people make the same point. I said, we have done such a good job of letting our students see the incredible importance of Whitman and Dickinson that they don't know how radical those two poets were because they don't know the other 19th century poetry. Now, fortunately, we have a lot of scholars of 19th century American literature. In fact, that's the group I'll be meeting with in Salem later this week. Um, but, as someone who was getting a PhD, I read all of the Whittier and the Longfellow and James Russell Lowell and all of that. And there's a lot of really good work in there, particularly historically good. Um, but when you read that, you really see why Whitman and Dickinson were not celebrated. Well, of course, Dickinson only published 6 poems in her lifetime, but why the kind of poetry they were writing would not be celebrated. And as a student of literary history, at least particularly in poetry, it has almost always been the case that many of the most interesting poets are not much celebrated in their lifetime, which is, really a sad situation. Some breakthrough, like a John Ashbery, who, by winning the three major poetry awards all in the same year, he sort of got canonized overnight. But before that, it was more of the avant-garde that paid any attention to him and knew what he was doing. Um, and all of African American poetry was sort of off the syllabus until the mid to late 1970s when the so-called canon wars happened in academia. So as a scholar, I think one of our jobs is to go back and find the treasures that people have forgotten about or never knew about in the first place. Now, again, Gil's in a whole different situation since he's a performer and a songwriter. I don't think the music will ever go away. I really don't. But again, I think he's gonna be recognized in that area, and I don't think people are gonna really celebrate him as being a writer the way he probably deserves. I really wish more people would read The Last Holiday. I think it's a really interestingly written book. There are difficulties dealing with it again because it's posthumous. An editor put it together afterwards. And as I mentioned, he had originally written in two ways, as a first person account and then as a third person. And what the editor did was to include just one of the first person chapters so you get a sense of what that was like. But this happens. Ralph Ellison was one of the most celebrated writers of all time. Um, but we only know his final work posthumously and in edited versions as well. I'm sure that Gil will continue to show up in TV commercials, which is ironic, at least. And I'm sure his music will still inspire young people. I see young people on Facebook, finding the records and posting them constantly. But I do hope more people will recognize him for his work as a writer. And again, his own self-destructive tendencies are one reason we don't have more of the writing. In fact, in the last years when he was arrested for crack cocaine, in one of the instances, he tried to tell the judge, this is so preposterous, he tried to tell the judge that he couldn't possibly be a crack addict because he'd written a 300-page autobiography. Nobody had seen the autobiography. And I read that and I said, well, that's exactly something somebody on speed or crack might do, That does not make the point he wants to make.
Sort of
And
like
I think,
Kerouac typing on a scroll on Benzodrine.
yeah. So, it always saddens me to think back to those days. So I always try to celebrate in memory. I try to keep him the guy in his 20s that I knew, and the guy in his 30s and 40s that I saw in performance. And yeah, I know he was using drugs then, but they hadn't gotten the grip on him that they came to have later. I remember as a young person in the 70s, I used to joke, it was a good thing nobody could afford cocaine. Well, then, of course, as with the invention of gin, they invented a kind of cocaine that everybody could afford. And that's when he became an addict. And we no doubt lost a lot of good writing that he would have done had he not been in that sad state. But he has left us more than most people do. You know, And as I keep saying, I want people to listen to the recordings. I want people to celebrate that part of him, which is the best known part of him. But I do want people to read The Last Holiday because I think they'll find a Gil Scott-Heron they didn't know was there, even though it's pretty clear in some of the recordings, you know.
Gil brought so much joy into my life at a time when, what was I, 18 years old, something like that, hearing that and being validated in my feeling that there was something terribly wrong with Ronald Reagan and the people who supported him and the people who continue to support him and the wave of neoliberalism that maybe he didn't unleash, but he amplified to the hundredth power. So completely validating. I resonated so deeply with Gil's music. And that you have taken so many hours of your own life to kind of give us this perspective in this essay, which I think that everyone in America should read to get some sense of that. I'm so grateful to you because of your efforts and the attention that it brings to someone who is a talent deserving much wider recognition, as Downbeat magazine would say. So thank you for that. Thank you for your time, and I wish
Do
you
we have time
continued
for
success with your work, man.
do we have time for one last comment?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. One of the things I really want people to appreciate, Gil, is how he could put together the revolutionary anger and the kind of joy that you're talking about. And the perfect example of this is what happened with the song The Bottle. On Winter in America, he had this song. It's about an alcoholic, you know, but as he was out performing it, I'm not sure where this happened. At some point, he heard a Latin band playing guanguancó rhythm, and he attached that to In the Bottle, so that every live performance from then until the end, after going through this whole thing about ain't it a shame, about this guy living in the bottle. Then suddenly it's Guan Guan Ko, and everybody gets up and dances for joy. And that was sort of characteristic of Gil, that he could, on the one hand, have this sharp social analysis of our ills, and then immediately join it to something joyful and communal that we could all get up and dance with. Anyway, thanks to you.